Well, this weekend, I've been rearranging the shop a bit. I've been trying to gain a little extra space, so maybe some more storage, moving my tools around a little bit. And I've discovered a couple things in the process. One, I like this wall as a focal point in my intros and outros. We'll explain more about what's on this wall at some later date. And two, my lathe stand. While the rolling cart is useful, it's very, very bulky and has a lot of wasted space in it. I looked online for pre-made lathe legs, stands that you buy, and they're really expensive. I didn't realize how expensive they were. And I'm not sure that I can find any that's going to fit my lathe. You know, it's a MIDI lathe, but it's got an extension on it. So it's a weird spacing. I don't know if I'd have to get 3 legs. I don't know. So instead, being the tinkerer, I've decided to make my own lathe stand. And this won't be a rolling cabinet. These will be beefy standalone legs. I'm going to make it all out of plywood. I think it'll work. There's only one way to find out. Come along with me. If you'll recall, a couple of years ago, we did a 2-part video series on making this lathe bench. Now at the time we mounted an antique lathe on it, and it worked out fairly well. Since then I've gotten this Delta MIDI lathe with an extension, and I mounted it on the same bench, but I've been less than pleased with the results. First thing is, it sits a little bit too high in this configuration. And also, I don't like the fact that the shavings collect around the motor. Well, because of that, I've decided to make some lathe legs. And the first step to doing that is to draw it out on a big piece of cardboard. Once I get my sketch like I like it, I'm going to cut it out with an X-Acto knife. Now you may have noticed we're only cutting out half of a leg assembly. Now the reason for this will become obvious in just a few seconds. Now that it's cut out, we're going to lay it on our piece of plywood, making sure the cross piece is parallel to the bottom of the plywood where we're lining it up, and we're going to trace it. After that, we just flip it over as a mirror image, butt it against the former tracing, and trace this half. So by using the same template to create both halves, we get a perfectly symmetrical leg assembly. And now I'm just using a saw to break down the plywood just to make it easier to handle. Once that's done, we're going to drill some holes at the corners of our leg assembly, and then connect the dots with our saws. This piece that we cut out has become our template. Now using it, we trace the next layer on a piece of plywood. And then while we've got it clamped, we're going to drill some reference holes. We'll cut out this next layer with a jigsaw, but we're being careful to leave the line. You can see we didn't cut all the way to the line because we're going to trim it up with a little trick. Since we've got those reference holes we drilled, we can screw it together with the screws, and then using this flush trim bit with the bearing on the top, we're going to cut the bottom piece to be exactly the same size as our template. Now the bearing rides along the edge of our template, which is on top, and the cutter sticks down below and cuts off anything overhanging on our second piece. Because of this, it is exactly the same size. Now we'll repeat this process on all the subsequent layers, always making sure to use the same template piece on top. Now each of the 2 leg assemblies is 7 layers thick. Now, to save a little plywood, I've decided to make a couple of the layers out of scrap. I do this by gluing and nailing the scrap where it overhangs the edges. Now I cut off anything that hangs out too far, and then the rest I flush up with my flush trim router bit again. As you can see, from the edge, it looks like a full layer, but on the inside, it's hollow. I only do this on a couple of the layers. The rest I want to be solid. And so, I just start the process of gluing and stacking the layers up. As I go along, I'll pin them with a brad nail, and then we'll come back later and we'll secure them with the screw. Now once all 7 layers are stacked up and glued, we've clamped them, and now we've marked where we want our screws. We're pre-drilling and putting screws in. We're going to do this from both sides of each leg assembly because it's too thick for one screw to go all the way through. And then we sand the edges smooth. By the way, do you think it's a coincidence that I made these to look like giant A's and my name starts with an A? Yeah, it is. It's totally a coincidence. I didn't even think about it until I made them. I just like the design, but it's pretty cool anyway, isn't it? To fill all of our screw holes, we're going to use walnut plugs. Here we are popping them out of the blank that we cut them from. With a little glue in each of the screw holes, we'll hammer in a plug. And then we'll take our random orbital sander and we'll sand them flush. Next, we're going to make the bed for the lathe to set on. These are actually going to be 2 rails that are parallel to each other with a gap in the middle. We're going to glue and brad nail and then screw these together like the rest of the lathe stand. I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of pocket holes in the ends of each side of the rail. This is a block that we've screwed together that will space the rails apart, and it'll also be a place for the middle of the lathe where the extension attaches to set on top of. Now with a little glue, we're going to clamp it in place so that we can drill it and screw it together with screws. After plugging these holes and sanding them flush, we're going to give everything a nice round over with this round over bit. These blocks will be part of the attachment point for the rails. They'll get attached with glue, brads, and screws like everything else. Now it's time for a little assembly. We take our rail section and fit it around the blocks on both of the legs. We're using a clamp to apply a little pressure to hold it in place. Now we screw into those blocks on both sides. And lastly, we install the pocket screws in the holes we drilled earlier. Now, while we've got the round over bit in the router, we're going to round over the edges of both rails. I'm going to use a clear gloss lacquer and give the whole thing a couple of good coats. The last thing to do is mount the lathe itself. I'm going to use a lag screw for this. I've pre-drilled a hole and I'll run it in most of the way with my impact driver, but then I'll finish it up with the socket. Careful not to over tighten it and crack the cast iron. Now let's have a look at the finished product. You can see it's 7 layers thick and very, very sturdy. Here we see that center section where the extension piece attaches to. And here we see the walnut plugs. These are very unnecessary, but I thought it was kind of a neat touch. Well, I couldn't be more pleased with how this turned out. This is the old one, if you remember from a previous video. This one I made for an old antique lathe that someone gave me, and I made the height based on its height and everything. But that lathe never really worked out. It had a lot of wobble in it. So when I bought my Delta lathe here, which I bought used, got a really good price on it. You can see it was a midi lathe, and the guy I bought it from had added an extension to it. So it can turn some pretty long things. Diameter wise, you're limited, but I don't usually turn anything all that wide anyway. But I mounted it on the old bench and it worked. The problem with a lathe bench that's solid like this is all your shavings fall down on the bench behind it. They get clumped up on the bench area and under your lathe. The good thing about lathe legs like this with an open bottom is all that dust and shavings fall to the floor below it, so they're not huddled around the motor of your lathe and you know, making it hot. So this worked out perfect. It's very sturdy. Before you ask, you know, most lathe legs are made out of cast iron or some heavy material, so that it has a good sturdy base. By laminating this plywood together, these legs are super heavy and super sturdy. Make sure everything is the exact heights, make sure everything is square, and you won't have any issues. Now some may say, well, I could go buy some lathe legs for not much more than what you'd pay for birch cabinet grade plywood. You're probably right, and there may be some cheaper lathe legs out there. But I had several sheets of birch ply that had been sitting around the shop for a couple of years now, stuff that I had bought for a previous project and got a really good deal on them, about 30 bucks a sheet. And so it really didn't cost me that much. Now, if you go to buy it now, it's probably twice that a sheet, so you're getting up into some money. But part of being a maker is just the fun of making something. Yeah, you could go buy it, but when you make it, it's that much more satisfying. So I appreciate you coming along with me, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope maybe that it's been helpful to you. And I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.